morning. Welcome to Viewpoint, your program of personalities, politicians, and perspectives. Politicians. A week from today, we will know what happened. I can only urge those of you who are still drinking Kool-Aid, don't go at the pool next Tuesday. Now, that's Bill's statement. That is not WLCN. That is not Jim Ash. That is not the corporate statement. That's just old Bill's prejudice here. We probably, if Mr. Ash is, oh yes, we always start with the kudo. And the kudo is coming up. All those folks who've devoted a lot of time on election day crawl out of bed early in the morning and go to the polls and work on behalf of the electorate to run the elections, including Judith K. Busby, who's been doing it for years. And so I believe Mr. Ash is probably, yes, I think we're ready at this point in time.
Mr. District Attorney, champion of the people, defender of truth, guardian of our fundamental rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Mr. District Attorney of Radio's 1930-something. that was always a great program we listened to. Go right ahead.
Yeah, but now, that must have run for a little while, because I remember listening to that.
Well, you're just a lot older than people know, so that's why. Why don't we introduce our fine guest this morning, please?
Yes.
Let's get right down to serious business.
We're fortunate.
Very fortunate.
This morning to have a chance to visit with Jonathan Wright. I've known Jonathan since his children were babies, and he's got a 23-year-old now. You really don't look old enough to have such grown kids. You're a handsome devil.
Well, you're very kind. Thank you. That was well worth the trip just to be here for that.
Don't whip that out, Jim.
Well, thank you for coming up and visiting with us. One thing that was spoken just before we signed on was the fact that Illinois calls our state's attorney the state's attorney. Everybody else in the known world calls it the district attorney. So here we are, outstanding in our field, huh?
We are unique in every way in Illinois. Not always in a good way, but this is not so bad. It is a little confusing, though. Some people hear state's attorney, and they kind of confuse it with the attorney general because they think a person is the attorney for the state of Illinois. So other states call them district attorneys, but in Illinois we call them state's attorneys, and each county has their own state's attorney.
Yes, and I imagine that there's sufficient work here in the county of Logan, the Luster's County of Logan, to keep you busy.
There is, unfortunately. It's the kind of job I tell people I wish we were slow in terms of our workload.
Sure. But
it's steady. And I actually did, in anticipation of that, just to give you and the listeners an idea of the volume. So in 2017, we filed 228 felony cases for Logan County, 257 misdemeanor cases, 63 DUI cases, 44 juvenile abuse and neglect cases, 39 juvenile delinquency cases, and 3,789 traffic cases.
Holy Friday, that's a bunch.
So that's what our office handles. There's myself and 2 assistant state's attorneys.
That was my next question. You have 2 assistants now.
Correct.
And budget-wise, I know that always that budget specter looms in every county office. Is it difficult to stay within a budget that they does the county board allot you a budget, sir?
They do. The county board is mandated by statute to provide sufficient funds for my office, county clerk, circuit clerk, and part of that, like any budget, private or public, is salary and payroll. Mm-hmm. So for the operation of the office, we have more than sufficient funds to do that. The difficulty is managing this caseload with the staff, and of course that takes up most of a payroll. Last year, the county board authorized a 3rd assistant to be hired. I did look for another assistant, a 3rd assistant, was not able to get one, and about halfway through the year, seeing where the county budget was trending, I actually opted not to go ahead and hire that 3rd assistant, and I turned the money back in because I know things are tight for the county, so I wanted to be able to do that for the county.
But now, you said that you looked for a 3rd assistant and had no luck. why is that? Is the practice of law in the state's attorney's office so foreign as far as a regular law practice is concerned?
It's not necessarily foreign, but the pay compared to the private sector in many instances doesn't necessarily mean up. Now, the advantage someone has coming for a state's attorney's position is they get IMRF pension and they get health care benefits. But other than that, the straight ratio between salaries, we're usually on the short side of things. And even with surrounding counties, Springfield, Sangamon County, Tazewell County, McLean County, sometimes it's difficult to match the payroll of larger counties.
Well, you mentioned Sangamon. Just this morning in the paper it said that they were getting a new state's attorney. Now, their current former state's attorney must have retired or gone
He
on
actually
to
received
fame
an
and glory.
appointment to be the U.S. Attorney for the Central District of Illinois. So
he stepped
there's a
over.
process that was been going on ever since President Trump came into office. Our district is one of the last districts to get an appointment. I'm not quite sure what took so long about that, but John Millhiser was one that put in, and he just received the announcement that President Trump appointed him. I'm not sure where that stands with the Senate confirmation, but he should be appointed and in office soon. So we're
Well-
excited for him. I did get to know him professionally. He's a good man and a great prosecutor, and he'll do a great job.
He's pretty good, a pretty illustrious record in this area, hasn't he, sir?
He does, yes. He was a first assistant in Sangamon for years, and then the state's attorney for at least a couple of terms.
But illustrious record or not, given his chances of appearing before those who will confirm him in the Senate, if he's on the wrong side of the fence, he may be in for a long poke.
Hopefully his process will be much smoother than Justice Kavanaugh's.
Oh, that was really...
Well, it can't get a lot worse.
No.
That was
unfortunately.
a zoo.
I'd like to make this comment, if I may, Mr. Ash, if you'll approve of it. No, seriously.
Jim just snickers.
Jonathan Wright here is our state's attorney, and he's representative of a group of Logan County employees who service up there in the various offices, who just give the county a whale of a lot of service for their buck they get.
Well, you're very kind. I appreciate that.
Well, I'm serious about that. You walk in and the deputy's at the door where you have to drop your car keys and so forth. Always very courteous, and that just kind of permeates what goes on underneath that dome up there. So you're working with a bunch of fine folks up there in the county.
Yeah, they're wonderful people in the Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Nichols and Sheriff-elect, wasn't a sheriff-elect yet, but he's got to go through the
Mark
general
Landers.
election, but he's unopposed, Mark Landers,
Yes.
doing a really good job with security.
Oh, yes.
It's a challenge when you look at that courthouse. It was built in 1904. Security was not an issue in those days.
No.
And it is now. If you read the national papers, there's an increasing number of incidents that happen at the courthouse or right outside the courthouse steps. And so it's a difficult piece of property to manage from a security standpoint because it wasn't designed with that in mind.
No.
And they do a great job. And the people that are there, Mike Bruce, Bob Rollins, Dave Seeloff, who do that now, and I'm sure when Mark Landers gets into office, he'll continue that. We're thankful at the courthouse that they do such a good job with it.
We've had an exceptional sheriff, and that's not going to diminish one whit with Mark taking over in the sheriff's office. It's going to be just a
Yeah,
great
I'm
sheriff
excited for him. Well, I'm going to miss Sheriff Nichols. It's been a pleasure to work with him, and we've gotten to be friends as well as professional
But
colleagues.
that was the
and so
old
he'll
days,
be
and
missed.
this was the new days, you see.
Right.
And with all respect to Sheriff Nichols, when you've been there, you kind of get a little jaded, not necessarily by design, but that's just kind of the way it works. And we were a young man coming in here with bright new ideas and so forth, and we may see some changes, possibly, probably.
It very well could be. I mean, everybody's going to take office and put their own stamp on the office, and that doesn't necessarily mean the previous administration wasn't doing it well. Sheriff Nichols done a great job. Mark Landers is going to put Mark Landers' stamp on it, and that's the way it should be.
That's right. That's right. Let's talk a little bit about the state's attorney's office, how it's staffed. You've already told us how it's budgeted. The county board and you work together on that. And let's just see what all your duties are up there.
So the State's Attorney's Office, as most people understand, handle the law enforcement. Technically, the State's Attorney is the chief law enforcement officer in the county. Now, we're not an investigative body. We don't hire any investigators, although the statute allows for that. The budget simply just isn't there for us to do that. So we rely on the Sheriff's Department, Lincoln Police, St. Joe's Police, Atlanta Police, Mount Pulaski Police. They do the investigation. They take the reports. They turn all of those reports over to us, and then our office reviews them to determine whether or not to file charges. The only exception to that would be traffic citations. Those are filed directly by the officers. DUIs, misdemeanor DUIs, traffic citations, speeding, driving while license suspended, they just file those citations indirectly, and then we take over the prosecution. But all misdemeanors and felonies we review. So when I mentioned that we had, in 2017, 228 felonies, I'm sure we had more than that submitted to us for review. But we obviously don't file every report that comes in. We weigh the evidence, sometimes send it back for follow-up investigation for other people to be interviewed, wait for lab results, and then we make all those charging decisions.
So you're the final arbiter as to whether it goes to court?
Correct. We can file those directly ourselves by what they call informations, or we take some cases to the grand jury that's convened at our request, and then if they believe there's enough evidence or probable cause, they'll return a bill of indictment, and if they think it's insufficient for probable cause, they'll return a no true bill of indictment.
Now, how often do we convene a grand jury, sir?
It's at the call of our office. Larger counties have them almost every week. Peoria County has one every week because of their volume. We probably do it on average 3 to 4 times a year.
Now, do you draw the names out of a hat?
That's all done by the jury commissioner.
Okay.
So the jury commissioners do that. They do it randomly based on driver's license lists from the Secretary of State's office, voting lists, things like that. They combine those, and then it's done in a random fashion. They draw names, just like it would be for a regular jury for a criminal trial, done randomly.
Well, Gretchen was in charge of that, wasn't she?
Yes, yeah, Gretchen Plattner.
Janet Kvitli now handles that for the...
Another good one.
Yes,
Yeah.
she does a great
We
job.
talked off air a minute. We want to be sure and bring this to the attention of our listeners, both of them. Jonathan, we mentioned the service to veterans.
Yes.
They have a new approach. So let's touch on that. Let's just a little bit, because this could be a very meaningful thing for some people that have troubles.
So the General Assembly of Illinois established by law that every circuit in the state of Illinois, judicial circuit, has to have a veterans court, and that was effective January 1st of this year. So for the 11th Judicial Circuit, which we are a part of, it's Logan County, McLean County, Woodford County, Livingston County, and Ford County. Those are the 5 counties in our circuit. We started a circuit-wide Veterans Court. And the premise behind that is recognizing that many who've served in the military oftentimes suffer from PTSD or other issues related to their military service. And sometimes criminal events flow from those issues that they're grappling with. And so this allows someone who intersects with the criminal justice system, who has a military background, to apply to be a part of this Veterans Court. That Veterans Court then works with the VA, works with mental health services, drug and alcohol if necessary, and provides an intensive oversight for them throughout the term of their probation if they're found guilty or they plead guilty. And then if they successfully complete all those terms, the conviction is vacated. And so it's off their record. And so it provides them an opportunity to get back on their feet through not only those services, but mentoring through other veterans. Because it's still early, we're trying to establish that, not only in Logan County, but also throughout the circuit. So where they can tap into veterans who've perhaps been through similar experiences, can guide them in ways that, those of us who've not been in the military can't. And so it's a great opportunity for everyone who's found themselves in that situation to be able to get back on their feet and have that service offered to them.
Another special court service is the drug court. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Certainly. So the drug court in Logan County has been in existence since 2010. And if someone intersects with the criminal justice system and they either plead guilty or are found guilty, and they are found to have a drug and alcohol addiction, then they can apply to be a part of this drug court process. And it's meant to be a very intense oversight term of probation. They start off on a weekly basis, meeting with probation weekly. They meet with the court weekly. And it's meant to be not only a fast process for sanctions, because what they found in studies is that if somebody's on probation and they get an event that could be sanctionable, what happens is it comes to our office, we file the petition, and then an attorney is appointed and a hearing's held, and that can be 3-4 months down the road. Well, in terms of getting a right response out of that person, we've lost that opportunity to have a quick turnaround response. So drug court is meant to be every week. If there's a sanctionable event, they're in court that next week, and the court can sanction them. And so it's done quickly. By the same token, if they have a good week, they get a reward, which can be as nothing more than an applause from the drug court team. Now, for you and I, we think, well, that's not much. But for somebody who perhaps has struggled all their life, depending on their socioeconomic background, depending on their drug and alcohol addiction, they've never experienced that. And so for them, that's an award. Sometimes as they progress, the award can be a gas card so they can get to drug and alcohol treatment, or they can go to their mental health counseling. Different rewards like that, or a movie pass or something of that nature.
Those are little things, but in and of themselves, they're very big things to the
They are very big
addictee. Those Joe Smith walking around the street, we don't know anything about addiction. It's a terrible, terrible disease, and some are able to struggle and shuck it, and some never get rid of it. And so we just have to look with compassion on addiction as what it is. It's a cancer.
We're learning more about it because we just went to a Illinois State Problem-Solving Court Association training, and part of that is the physiological impact of using certain drugs. And I can't claim to understand all of it. I'm not a medical expert, but they showed color images of the brain of individuals who'd used methamphetamine, who'd used heroin, and how it affects certain frontal lobes and their thought processes, and it does have a physiological impact. That's not to say it can't be corrected if they remain sober for a period of time, but while they're immersed in that addiction, it does affect them physiologically.
Have these two special court programs been in operation for a bit?
So the drug court for Logan County has been in existence since 2010, and then the Veterans Court was started just this year. That's circuit-wide.
Okay. So with the drug court then, you've got enough time in on that so that you know where it's going.
Correct.
So what's your feeling about it? Is this a possible answer for lots of people?
It can be, of course, if they're in that situation. Ultimately, it's up to the person. It's a very difficult program, and it's meant to be difficult in the sense of really getting them to the place of sobriety, hopefully, and being successful and back on their feet. And we've seen some success through it. And I think the successes, percentage-wise, are probably better than just putting them on traditional probation. And so it does offer that hope and that service.
Good.
And so we're seeing some results from it.
We're talking about addiction. We have an addiction up here, Mr. Wright, and it's called addiction to our sponsors. And so we're going to yield to that addiction right now, sir. Go ahead, Jim. And we're back live in the office here of WLCN, high on the hill at Gracie Row, County Road 2250. Our guest this morning, a man whom I've admired for a long time, and who the voters should admire for the job that he's doing. State's attorney is a pretty visible job, especially when things pop. Day in and day out, it's just up there grinding out its business and serving the people in the way it's charged to do. What do you find is the most difficult part of being a state's attorney, Jonathan? Just so many ramifications to that question. Probably shouldn't have you put it out there.
It's a good question, and one I need to be asking myself to stay fresh, because we talk about the criminal cases, and I know while the commercial was being played, we talked about child cases, abuse and neglect cases, and maybe discussing some of those generally speaking. There's a lot of difficult things we have to see and hear and process. And you mentioned before that when you are in a public position, particularly law enforcement, it can be easy to be jaded. And that's important for me. It's important that my assistants, it's important that those in law enforcement, we keep fresh and we don't become jaded as we go through this process, that every case we try to look at fresh, that every case we try to stay fresh in terms of our process, that we have outside interests that keep us connected, so that we're seeing people outside of just what we see in police reports. And so I think that's really a big part of what I need to do as a state's attorney, is to remain a husband, a dad, a member of the community, interacting with people, and not just locked into criminal cases that can really skew the way I think. And if it skews the way I think, it can skew the way I do my job.
Yes. Oh, but it would be so easy to have that happen to you.
It's very easy. So it's something, I have to be on guard with, and everybody in law enforcement, I think, has to be on guard with. And we're privileged with the Lincoln Police, County Sheriff's Department, the smaller departments. They do a good job with that, but we have to be mindful of that in all that we do.
I think that one of the reasons I made the comments about our county employees and so forth, and it would spill over into our city law enforcement, is that we are a small community. And so there's a little more intimacy in being, so Jonathan Wright better than you might know John Millshauser down in Sangamon County, just because of the smallness of it. And so, having said that, when you get certain cases like under the Department of Children and Family Services, where Judy's daughter serves so well, cases come up and they become more intimate to the state attorney's office.
Very much so. And we do want to be passionate about what we do, so that's the balance. We want to be passionate. We want to be there to protect the community. We want to be a voice to the victims, but then we also have to make sure that we don't, again, get so immersed that we lose sight of the bigger picture of what we're there to do. One of the highest compliments I ever got, I had a case a number of years ago, involved a shooting, and the victim was an individual who I had prosecuted a number of times and had his own history. And after the case was done, he came up to me and he said, "Thanks." And I said, "Well, we're doing our job and we're here to do the best we can." And he said, "No, thank you for treating me like a real person."
See?
And I didn't really understand what I was doing by trying to offer him victim services and reach out to him in that way. And that stuck with me as a reminder that I need to stay fresh in what I do, because what I was doing and not even realizing meant an awful lot to him. And that stuck with me.
But it shows how grounded you were are in performing the duties of the state's attorney.
Mm-hmm.
Well, by the grace of God, I'll stay that way.
Yeah.
You see, we just don't understand one another sometimes. That poor guy had probably never had anybody say to him, "Let me help you, we'll figure this out."
Right.
Here's a man who had no self-esteem at all, and suddenly somebody made him important in his eyes. So that was a very important thing you did. Let's take it from the top. Let's say there's a crime committed, and they've caught the culprit, robbery or whatever. How does that progress from the initial arrest up through to perhaps trial or perhaps no trial?
So we're advised if it's a significant case, a death or a near-death case, we're advised when it happens. So we get that call 24/7. Oftentimes, before it even comes to our desk, we're responding to the courthouse to get search warrants, either for homes or vehicles or other areas where evidence may be. We get those search warrants. We may roundtable with law enforcement to see what needs to be done next, ideas about who to be interviewed, how to approach the interview process. If you have victims that are minors, we have child advocacy centers that can do forensic interviews for those individuals. If it's an adult victim, if they have relatives, how we kind of expand and broaden those investigations. And then once it comes to us, we make that decision about whether we're going to file charges if there's enough evidence. If we go by way of information where we charge it, or we go through the grand jury. For example, I tend to take cases to the grand jury that involve felony sex offenses where the victims are minors. The grand jury process is secret. There's transcripts made, but it's a secret process. And I think there is some value to the minor, given that we're a smaller community and names are known and families are known, that if we can protect them in that way in the initial process. And then once the case is charged, then it's a matter of making sure that due process is afforded the defendant. Their attorney is appointed either privately or through a public defender. Discovery is then tendered to the defense attorney. And by discovery, all police reports, evidence that we have, statements that we have is turned over so they can review it. Oftentimes, plea negotiations occur then after that point. And if it's unresolved, then it goes to a jury trial. And in Logan County, we do jury trials now every other month.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the grand jury, because they don't have to be involved in every case that comes to your office at all.
Correct.
Well, let's talk about what goes to them and how that's decided.
That's decided really state's attorney by state's attorney. I have talked to some state's attorneys who don't frankly ever use the grand jury, and they just file in an information directly. Now the balance is if an information is filed in directly, then the defendant has a right to a preliminary hearing, and the judge hears the evidence to determine if there's probable cause. The grand jury is the alternate to that, and they decide if there's probable cause. There are some counties where everything for felonies goes through grand jury. I just tended to kind of look at what we have, the nature of the case, the magnitude of it. If there's death involved, reckless homicides, attempt murders, then I take those through the grand jury. Otherwise, most of our cases are charged by way of information.
So the grand jury then is responsible for deciding whether that case continues?
Correct. They determine if there's probable cause to support the evidence. So a regular jury or a petit jury is one at the end of the case determining whether the state has proven their evidence beyond a reasonable doubt for a conviction. A grand jury serves at the beginning to determine is there enough probable cause to move this case forward, to support an initial charge. They do not determine whether the person's guilty or not.
Now, does the grand jury deal with each case just by the written records, or does the grand jury meet the offender, for lack of a better word?
Rarely do we subpoena the suspect because, of course, they have a Fifth Amendment right, so we don't want to put them in a position where they're confronted with those issues. Typically, in a grand jury case, we're subpoenaing the investigating officer who comes in and goes over all of the evidence. Here's what happened. Crime scene was called. This is the evidence that was recovered. Here's the interview statements that we have. And then they present all of that to the grand jury. The grand jury then convenes. When they convene and deliberate, nobody's in the room. The court reporter steps out, I step out, any witnesses are not there, and it's all private. When we come back in, they have a couple of options. They can say, Mr. State's Attorney, there's not sufficient evidence, no true bill. Or they can say, we want to hear from other witnesses, so we want to subpoena witnesses. They can subpoena medical records, bank records, things of that nature. Or they can come back and say, we think there's enough evidence, and we want to return a true bill of indictment.
Now, the grand jury consists of how many jurors? Is that 12 men, good and true?
It's 16 grand jurors.
Okay.
And so we have to have a quorum of 12. So 16 are sworn in. We have to have a quorum of 12. And then 9 have to vote that there's sufficient evidence for an indictment. So unlike a conviction at the end of the case for a petit jury where it has to be unanimous, there just simply has to be 9 concurring that there's sufficient evidence for probable cause.
This is pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah. How often do you convene a grand jury about?
Usually once every about 3 to 4 months.
What is the stipend for a grand jury when they per diem?
Unfortunately, I'm probably the wrong person to ask on that. That would be Janet Kvitli, but I know that was just all jurors got an increase in pay, so to speak, for their service, I think, this past year. But it's still a nominal amount of money.
Very nominal. Is there a lighter side at all to being a state's attorney, Mr. Wright?
I don't know about a lighter side, but there's an enjoyable side. I enjoy, as you mentioned, everybody I work with. Law enforcement, we build camaraderie that is pretty special. Sheriff Nichols is retiring. He's done a great job. I'm going to miss him professionally and personally. There's a camaraderie that you have when you've been through a case like the Christopher Harris Beeson case, and you've been 24-hour cycles for days on end, and you've kind of seen each other in the difficult times and the stressful times, and tried to help each other professionally and personally through those times. There's a camaraderie that's built, and I enjoy that. Not only just from a law enforcement standpoint, but from county employees. Sally Turner's retiring. She's going to be greatly missed, and I've really enjoyed working with her, and so those relationships are really pretty special to me, and I cherish those.
On a lighter side, I will recount an episode way back goes the days of the Justice of the Peace. I think that's what the level they. Bob Thornton was the judge at the time. And this character is gone, going to go out and use names because he's, anyway, the fellow named Jigs Justice. He was a street character. And in those days, Jonathan, they called the Vandalia Correctional Center the Peanut Farm. And so he was up there for whatever reason, one of his many appearances before Bob, and it was getting to be about winter time. Bob says, I think you probably need 90 days at the peanut farm. So something. 90 days came and went, and he came back and he saw Judge Thornton on the street, and he says, I want to tell you, there's no damn peanuts down there. But you had to know the characters to really appreciate the story. You have habituals that appear on your desk on a, hopefully not a frequent basis, but do you have
we do have
problems?
Repeat offenders, but again, that's the challenge for us as prosecutors, that when we get the case and it has a name of someone who has a history, that we don't make knee-jerk reactions, that we look at it, setting aside that name and their history, and determine, is there sufficient evidence, is this the right thing to do to move forward? One of the things I like about being a state's attorney is our highest ethical challenge can kind of be summed up at this: do the right thing. And that's
about as basic as it gets.
It's about as basic as it gets, but it's one of the most challenging things to get, because a lot of people can look at the same case and see the right thing as being a lot of different outcomes. But that's what guides us. Do the right thing.
Yes.
Bring justice, seek justice. And so when we get someone in a report, we just need to fight that kind of human nature instinct to say, well, okay, we've had this individual before. We've got to shed all of that and look at what the evidence is and really find out if the evidence there supports it. If it is, prosecute it. If it doesn't, then not prosecute it and decline those charges.
You have to kind of depersonalize things, don't you?
Very much so.
Like, for instance, I've known you for a very long time, but if I appeared before you, we'd have to pretend we never saw one another before in our life, right?
Correct. And if there's ever a situation where it's too close, we have a contract with the State Appellate Prosecutor's Office where if I have a conflict, say it would be a family member or a really close friend, that it would be impossible to say, well, we'll pretend like we don't know each other. We refer that out to the State Appellate Prosecutor's Office, and then they assign it to a prosecutor who doesn't know that person, doesn't know the situation.
Oh, yeah, that's a brilliant idea. Who came up with that?
Not me.
Excepting, of course, the Supreme Judge, do you have, to whom do you report as the State's Attorney of Logan County, sir?
Technically, the people of Logan County.
Voters.
The voters. Now, I certainly work with and the judges in our county quite a bit, and when I'm in their courtroom, I answer to them because it's their courtroom, and I take that very seriously. But in terms of outside of the courtroom, how I handle the office, it's ultimately the voters.
For your position, you have to have started when you were just a very little boy at your mother's knee.
He was never a little boy. He was a young boy. Never a little boy.
A little shorter than he is now, at any rate. You have to bring a lot to this. You have to have parents who stressed being honest, being fair, being kind, being respectful, all those things.
I'm so grateful for that. I hope my mother's listening. She moved a couple of years ago out to Castle Manor, and so I told her I was going to be on the radio today. with two very famous
Does she have TV?
people.
She can
Oh,
watch
yes,
it.
right.
Does she have TV in her room?
She does have TV in
Okay,
her room.
we'll tell you how she can look at that.
But she's your generation, Mr. Gossett, so radio is what she grew up on. But
yeah.
She's at Castle Manor. My father passed away a number of years ago, but I'm so thankful for what they instilled in me and how they raised me.
Amen.
And this job makes me appreciate it so much more. When I say in 2017 we had 44 cases of juvenile abuse and neglect, you see the opposite end of that spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
Really heartbreaking situations for a lot of children who don't understand and can't connect to the kind of homes you and I were raised in,
Yeah.
with parents who loved us and invested in us and taught us right from wrong. And unfortunately, there's a lot of children out there who aren't getting that.
They're pawns.
With
They're
your
pawns on that board. They
with
really
your
are.
time in the court, do you think you're seeing a growth in that kind of situations?
I don't know about a growth, but we're seeing more severe situations with juveniles. When I first started, and if a young person got into trouble with the law and they were in court and they got all the admonitions from the judge in juvenile court with their parents, their eyes would get like saucer plates. They would be shocked. They'd have the appropriate, I don't know if fear is the right word, but sobriety about what's going
Well,
on.
respect at any rate.
Now we're seeing a growing number of juveniles who just don't care.
Jonathan,
And I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but they don't care. If they say, well, you could end up in the Juvenile Justice Authority, they don't care.
Maybe that's better than where they're living. Who knows?
It's
would you
hard to know
say-
what they're thinking.
Would you hazard a guess that the media has a play in that? My personal observation is the media has a terrible impact on a lot of youngsters.
By media, what do you mean?
Well, I'm talking about the programs, there's so-called programs on TV and so forth that, there's just not much out there that is
Uplifting.
That's the word I'm looking at. It's uplifting. I mean, it's not worth a tinker's damn, most of it.
Well, I agree in the sense that there's a lot of violence in the media.
Yes.
A lot of the gaming systems that they now come out with. Not all of it. I certainly don't want to stereotype that every young person who plays a video game is doing wrong things, but there's a lot of violence out there. Grand Theft Auto, things like that really breed kind of an idea of getting away from the police. They're the bad guy, and even on some of them, they have options to shoot the police officers and things like that. And I can't blame that for everything, but it certainly doesn't help anything.
Well, it's not a sterling recommendation
Right.
for behavior.
Do you have anything that on your docket now or on your desk that may be of significant interest to the community, or is all pretty much routine right now?
We have, trying to think, 2 cases of attempt murder. Now, one of those cases of attempt murder has 4 co-defendants. Another one has 1 defendant, so 2 separate cases. And then we have a 3rd case that was a shooting that happened over the summer. Not an attempt murder case, but it's an allegation of aggravated battery with a firearm. And of course, they're all allegations at this point. None of them have gone to trial, but those are certainly
But they
larger
require
cases.
just hundreds of man-hours of investigative work and conferences and so forth before it gets to the bench.
My conference table I can't use much because some of these cases have so many expandables that they eat up my conference table because of all of the investigation work that's gone in, the
Yeah.
reports, the DVDs, the CDs.
So like the juggler, you've just got a lot of balls in the air at one time.
That one-arm paper hanger.
Yeah. Now, do you have to read every single report?
Well, I don't read every single report because I have 2 assistants, but those cases that I take over, absolutely. We need to read every aspect of those reports. We need to listen to every interview. We need to view all the photographs. It's important that we make sure we do that, not only on the front side before we make a charging decision, but going to trial, you really need to know a case backwards and forwards.
Do you delve into their life as a child?
That would come
and
if they're...
reasons, maybe?
Well, that would come if they're convicted, then they're entitled to a sentencing hearing, and before a sentencing hearing occurs, the court will order what's called a pre-sentence investigation report. And court services then will meet with them and go through their family background, their parents, siblings. They'll go through any criminal history, if they have any. They'll go through whether they've had any issue with alcohol or drugs, any history of mental health issues. So as a court makes a sentencing decision, the court hopefully has a lot of information information. And that can include then statements from friends and family of the defendant who might be able to say, here's what they've been going through. And it also includes statements from the victims, how it's impacted them, so the judge can kind of have all of the information.
What about the person as they face their detention? Should that come about?
What do you mean by that?
Well,
She's not sure.
I've been in prison because of the prison program where you read, and but I've never lived there, you know. So I suppose most of the people who go haven't been there either. Is there any preparation for?
There's no preparation. They know if a person's found guilty, it's usually about 4 to 6 weeks from the time they're found guilty to when we have a sentencing hearing. And if prison is a possible sentence range, obviously that's something they need to have that plan B, that if they are sentenced to prison, they've gotten their affairs in order, because if the judge says prison on that day, they're taken into custody to the county jail, and then in 4 to 5 days, the Department of Correction picks them up, and they're shipped off to serve their sentence.
Since you mentioned that you have 3 murder cases going,
Attempt murder. Thankfully, just attempt murder.
Oh, okay, good. That's lucky for those people who were the
Very much
intended
so.
victims. So what do you say about guns from your personal self as opposed to your state's attorney self?
Well, my personal self is I don't ever see the guns as the problem. I do believe strongly in the Second Amendment, and I do think that the problem is not with law-abiding citizens having guns.
Am I correct in saying this? No amount of legislation can prevent somebody from getting a gun. If a bad guy wants to get a gun, he or she will get a gun.
And Chicago, which I know in the state of Illinois is the butt of many
Separate
jokes,
state.
but
Yeah.
they're the proving ground for that. Their city does not allow any firearms by law, anyone to possess a firearm in the
Well,
city of
that
Chicago.
sure helped them a lot.
So there you are.
And we see tragic numbers every weekend that
Yeah.
just stagger the mind. So the answer is not responding in the sense that the gun is the problem. There's a lot of issues that came into play, and each of these attempt murder cases that we have arose out of different fact patterns. One arose out of an allegation of a domestic violence situation. The other 2 are kind of linked to allegations of drugs and things of that nature. And so those are the real core issues to me rather than the gun.
Are drugs a commonality?
They're a commonality with a lot of crimes that we face. Whether they're property offenses, the person has an addiction, and they're maybe stealing checks from an aunt or an uncle or somebody they're cleaning house for, or they steal from Walmart or a business owner downtown. We see a lot of property offenses that are linked back to that, and then sometimes crimes of violence in relation to it.
You mentioned domestic violence. That's something that I can't wrap my head around, you know? But it's common, isn't it?
It is common. We get a lot of domestic violence cases every week, people that are in custody, and it's fitting to bring it up. Today's the last day of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And it's important to encourage people who are victims to reach out for services. There's a lot of services in Logan County to report those offenses because there's all kinds of cycles that victims go through where they don't report, where we actually struggle getting victims to come forward.
Probably. They're probably embarrassed that this is going on in their house.
The subject of domestic violence is such a serious one that I'm almost afraid to make light of it by saying we're going to have domestic violence in this studio if we don't bring this conclusion to a close.
Oh.
Jonathan Wright, State's Attorney of Logan County. We appreciate very much, number one, taking your time to come up here. We realize, and the voters need to realize, this is a very, very busy gentleman up there. You're sure getting your money's worth out there, folks. So thank you very much. Having you and your community, your family in our community has been a real asset.
Well, it's my privilege. I appreciate the kind words, and I really do count it a privilege to serve this community. It's a great
Thank
place.
you. Well, I try to close with a closing I found somewhere. Little trite, maybe. One thing I learned a long time ago as a prosecutor, that it's tough to get people to obey the law if there's no penalty for breaking it. Thank you, Jonathan Wright.
Thank you very much to both.
Thank you.